Welcome, everyone, to another Lunch with the Pastor. I hope you have had a good week so far. This week, we are going to finish our little Bible study on strong grace. This is the last week for it. So we are going to be finishing off with, if you've been following along with the sermons over on Sundays, we are going to talk about something that we talked about just a few weeks ago. The rich young man. We're going to go into a lot more detail, obviously, than a sermon can get. As much as I love sermons and I love giving them and all that kind of stuff, we all know that in the sermons, I only have a finite amount of time to talk about something. So Bible study is where you really can get to the meat and potatoes, really get into deep into the story, and really come away with a lot of extra stuff. So today we're going to dive into the rich young man's story and talk about how grace was used in that particular situation to bring salvation, as well as what it really looks like in a practical and real sense of the word to the world. So why don't we begin this afternoon with a word of prayer, and then we will dive into the text. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for this opportunity to come together to learn more of your word, to speak together about these things, and to come away with a better understanding of you, your Son, his ministry, and what we are in that ministry and how we can further it. So, Father, as we come together, we just pray that you would take care of us, that you would allow us to have open hearts and open minds, so that whatever is said here is something that is nourishing to our souls and strengthening to our spirits and to our faith. We pray all this in Christ's name. Amen. All right, so as I said before, through this whole series that we've been doing this, we've been looking at the interactions between Christ and so many different kinds of people. We saw him interact with the Samaritan woman at the well. We saw him interact with a woman who was caught in adultery, and we witnessed him take care of the Herodians, the Pharisees and Sadducees, and we've also seen him take care of one individual Pharisee in Nicodemus. All of these interactions bring about a new understanding of how Christ operates and how grace is bestowed and how Christ loves every person he comes into contact with, but in a different way than the world now tells us that we ought to love. As I said before, this whole series was built upon something that was very passionate to me. It still is, that our world continues to tell us that the only way to truly love, to truly show grace to an individual, is to accept who they are right now without any other caveats to it. And at some level, that is very right. It's very gracious, because no one wants to be told, well, I can't love you right now because you're not perfect, because none of us are perfect, right? And that's where that stems from, is this idea that, well, since none of us are perfect, we cannot expect our fellow brothers and sisters to be perfect either. And people will go back and quote, from Matthew, where Jesus says, take the plank out of your own eye before you study the speck in your brother's. But here's the issue. When we talk about acceptance, the acceptance should be, I accept you as a brother or sister, even though you're flawed. And because you are now my brother or sister, I now want to walk with you in both of us going on our way towards perfection. Which means that throughout the journey, I want you to tell me when I have messed up, when I've taken the wrong path, when I'm doing things that I shouldn't be doing, and vice versa. I will do the same for you. We are in this together. We are brothers and sisters I love you so much that I want you to become perfect. I want you to follow Christ even more closely. And so that's what I'm going to do. And so in our world today, we hear this whole thing over and over and over again, that to love someone is to just accept who they are and not try to change them. But when we read the scriptures and we see Christ, we see when Jesus loved others, he expected change. He loved them because he saw potential. He loved them because he saw what they could be, what they were intended to be, what God had called them to be. But where they were when he first saw them was not in that right place. Jesus still loved them. There's no one on earth that could tell you that he didn't. But he demanded that in his love, he wanted them to be better. And as I said, that's the whole premise of this series, is just this idea that the world has lost its vision on what love truly is. It's not just acceptance of who you are right this second. It's not just acceptance of, oh, well, you're allowed to do whatever you want to do as long as it doesn't, bother me, or whatever the case may be. True grace, if we take it from Christ, if we love other people as Christ loved us, well, Christ loves us unconditionally. He seeks us out. He's always by our side. No matter how far we go, no matter how many mistakes we make, he's always right there. But he doesn't accept the sin. He doesn't accept the mistakes. He reprimands. He calls us to repentance. He asks us to change ourselves. And that is why, and that is how he loves. So we've seen Jesus interact with the positive people, the woman caught in adultery, the Samaritan woman, but we also saw Jesus interact with two groups of people who were not friendlies, right? We saw him with the Herodians, Sadducees, and scribes. We saw him, or Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, and Herodians. We also saw him with Nicodemus, how they attacked and everything else. And again, we see the same kind, or at least I hope I was eloquent enough. I hope that I had the right words to show you that Jesus truly did love those people. Jesus really did. All he wanted from them was for them to lay down their incorrect interpretations, their incorrect ways of living, and pick up the mantle of what they had actually been called to do. He doesn't come out and say, you people aren't worthy of being Pharisees or religious leaders or whatnot. He doesn't say that. He says, you got it wrong. And he implores them to get it right. Because if they were to get it right, the world could be saved. But they won't do it. So what we're going to end our study with is looking at an interesting story. And as I said a couple weeks ago in one of my sermons, we talked about the rich young man. But we're going to go into a lot more detail here at the Bible study, because we're going to look at a man who seeks out Christ, who is looking for affirmation of his lifelong appreciation of the law, and is also seeking admittance into Christ's following. Now, this man's request is unlike the enemies of Christ, in which case this rich young man has no malice. There's no intent to undermine or to destroy Christ or to get rid of him. The rich young man truly is coming to Jesus and saying, I want to be your follower. I've heard your messages. I've learned I've learned a little bit about you. I believe that you are the one that I need to follow. Let me follow you. This is the rich young man. He is a positive influence because he really is wanting to be with Christ. Unfortunately, And this is why this story becomes very interesting in the grace period, in the grace talks. The man ends up being in the same exact boat as the enemies of Christ, because just like the enemies of Christ who walk away from him, the rich young man eventually will walk away from Christ. Head hung low, because he cannot change his worldview and his understandings to match what Christ is asking him to do. Christ's ultimate statement to the young man is one that is both harsh and welcoming. All right? Though most people don't see it as such, and that's why I wanted to really dive into this, because the statement that Jesus makes to the rich young man is something that, yes, is a harsh statement. It's not something that's warm and fuzzy and cuddly, but it is exactly what is needed. And hopeful, and that statement should give hope to all others who want to become followers of Christ. So we're going to start with the way that the young man addresses and speaks to Christ. The first thing that the young man does is he says, "Good teacher," right? And so we have the rich young man. And the first thing he says is, "You are a good teacher." Well, what does that mean, right? If we go into the scriptures, we find that the word that is here is a word that means perfect or holy, right? So what this actually means is that when the young man calls to Jesus, he is saying that Jesus is the perfect teacher, or in better terms, he is a godly teacher. There's nothing else, and Jesus makes this comment, right? Jesus, time and time again throughout his ministry, tells people that what he teaches is not from him, but it's from his Father. While he is in the Father and part of the Trinity, he doesn't want the words or miracles or teachings to be attributed to him. He wants everyone to see what he does, and through those things see his Father, right? That's Jesus's ultimate goal, is that with everything he does, everything he says, everywhere he goes, every person he comes in contact with, he is merely a mirror who is reflecting the greatness of his Father. So that when you saw him, anyone would know you were seeing the Father, right? That is what Jesus' whole point of his ministry is. That's what he does every single time when he comes into contact with people, when he talks with people, he interacts with people. That's exactly what he does. He tries to make sure that everyone knows that he is from the Father, right? So what this does is so what Jesus is trying to hearken back to is the greatest commandment. And I'm not talking necessarily what Jesus says is the greatest commandment. I'm talking about going back to the Old Testament, what Jesus pretty much quotes when he answers that question to the Pharisees, Deuteronomy 5. In the 6th verse, it says, love your God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, and your strength, right? And that's what Moses tells the Israelite people. If you're going to worship God this way. And what Jesus wants everyone to understand is you're supposed to love God, not Jesus, God. Now, for those of us that are Christians, this is a hard statement because we see Jesus as God. Jesus is not below God. Jesus is not just a human. Jesus is God. And so we say, well, we're supposed to worship Jesus, and God. But what Jesus is trying to say, and he says throughout his entire ministry, don't worship me, worship God. Because if you follow and love God, you in turn will be following and loving me. Um, but that's what we find in what Jesus says is he wants us to understand that it's not following one or loving one over the other or loving one instead of the other. It's love God and you will end up loving me because I am in the Father. And that's what Jesus says all the time when he continues to point to his Father as um, the sole part of his ministry. When he points to God to say that that he's the one that gives him all the words and miracles and everything else, that's exactly what he's trying to say. Is That's exactly what he's saying is the fact that um, he wants you to focus on God, not focus on him. Um, so the next thing that we come to is something that I've always found very interesting about the interaction between the rich young man and Jesus. We sit here and claim all the time that there's only been one perfect person that's ever walked the earth, right? And that's Jesus. He lived a perfect, sinless, blameless life, um, and that's something that's very important. Um, And the reason it's important is because the only way that he can be the best sacrifice, the perfect sacrifice for the atonement of sins, in which case the only way that you and I are ever going to be saved, or anyone else on the earth is going to be saved, is through the blood of Jesus Christ. And because Jesus is a perfect human being and God at the same time, his sacrifice was ultimately perfect, and therefore was able to cover the multitude of sins, not only of that generation, but of all generations. And that's why we celebrate the resurrection, the cross and the resurrection, because the perfect sacrifice was made, and Jesus was that perfect sacrifice. But then we get to this story of the rich young man, and we find a young man who is also perfect. And I'm talking perfect in the legalistic sense here, perfect in the Jewish understanding sense, right? Because the Jewish understanding of perfect would be someone who literally lived within the law, never broke one of the laws, which there were, 365 different. There are not. I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head. There were more laws than just the Ten Commandments. All right, you go read Deuteronomy, you go read Leviticus, you go read Numbers, and you'll find truckloads of other laws that are there. And a perfect Jew would be one that would follow all of them. Now, the rich young man comes up to Jesus, and the first thing he says is, "I want to be your follower." Jesus then turns around and says, "Well, follow the law, right? Follow the commandments, follow the entirety of the law." And the scripture looks at the young man and says that Jesus loved him. And the reason that he loves him is because when the young man comes and says, "Well, I've done that since I was a child," Jesus doesn't correct him. Jesus ultimately says he's right. So at some level, we have two perfect men talking to each other. We have Jesus, who is perfect because he's God, and therefore can live the perfect life. And we have the rich young man, who is the perfect Jew, who has lived the perfect law-abiding life. So, and if you ever want to question that, if you ever want to say, well, maybe he's just making a statement of, well, I've done a pretty good job. The fact of the matter is that um, throughout Mark, which is where we're getting this story, um, Mark makes it clear that his understanding of Jesus, his interpretation of Jesus, is that because he is God, he can always see into people's hearts. He doesn't have to take you at your word. He knows exactly what's going on in your heart. It's like that thing that you can't lie to yourself in the mirror because you know everything about yourself. Jesus is the same way. Jesus has the ability to see within someone's heart and say, okay, I know exactly what's going on with you. I know exactly who you are. Ultimately saying, you cannot lie to me. You cannot exaggerate to me. You can't change who you are to me. You are always going to look exactly the way that you're supposed to look, right? And so when Jesus doesn't say anything about this, we can assume, because of the way that Mark has written his gospel and the way that Mark has created his understanding of Jesus, where Jesus can read other people's hearts, it means that Jesus knows that the rich young man isn't just saying this or claiming something false, but that he really has led a life that affirms and upholds the entirety of the law. He is the perfect Jew. Now just wrap your head around that for a second, because that's a big statement of this young man. He was the perfect Jew, which means that ultimately you would think that if you're the perfect Jew, you shouldn't need salvation, right? You should be part of the kingdom already. It should be over. Now, what this also does is it distinguishes him even more from the enemies of Christ, the Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians, scribes, Nicodemus, all that kind of stuff. Because the rich young man, while having lived by all accounts, the perfect life, is still seeking the key to eternal life. You notice this? The Pharisees and the rest of them think they've already got it. They're nowhere close to being perfect, and yet they believe, well, we've already got the key of life. We've already got the key to all this. We already understand it all. We know all the scriptures. We've got it. It's done. It's over. We've got everything that we need. We don't need what Jesus is offering. And then we have the rich young man who is perfect, who can actually make that claim and be truthful, and he is still seeking. He's still seeking that key. He's still seeking that eternal life. Which means that the young man must have had the understanding that just following the law was not a guarantee to eternal life. Again, a separation between him and the religious elites. The elites truly believed that if you followed the law, if you made the right sacrifices, if you did all that kind of stuff, that was it. That was over. It was done with. If you did that stuff, that you had everything taken care of. The rich young man had understood the scriptures enough to know that that's not how it works. That just upholding the law wasn't enough. There had to be something more. He's really seeking a new answer. He's seeking a different understanding. Now, unfortunately, the answer that he gets is not one that he likes, right? Because we know how this story goes. Now, the next thing that a lot of people like to use here, and it's not a far leap. I have to admit that it's not a far leap to make this assumption. Jesus tends to be very harsh towards people who are rich, materially rich. I'm talking. There are many statements that he makes that seem to indicate that if you want to be a disciple, you need to be in poverty, basically. You need to have almost no material possessions, that you can't have a savings account or cars or anything else in this world, because that they will become your God, and you won't be able to. And we've got the statement of Jesus when he says, it would be easier for a rich man or for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. I mean, that's a pretty condemning statement of where Jesus kind of places rich people. So right now we've got a rich young man who comes to Jesus, and what does he do? He tells him to get rid of all of his riches. He says you have to get rid of everything, which at some level, as I said, the general understanding of that, the easy assumption, the easy logical step next would be to say that in order to become a disciple, you have to go into poverty. In order to become a disciple, you have to just give up everything that you got. You have to give up all your money. You have to give up all your possessions. You have to go live as a hermit in a rock somewhere. And that's the only way to become a disciple. But the fact is that that's not exactly true. It's not untrue, but it's not exactly true either. Jesus claims that in order for the young man to follow him, the young man must give up all of his possessions. Now the question is, why? Why is this what is needed in order for him to become a disciple? And the fair thing, the true answer is that there's actually a number of answers, and each is true in its own way. Now the first understanding is the fact that yes, disciples have to give up everything. Remember back in two of the other gospel accounts, Jesus sends out the disciples before his crucifixion. He sends out the disciples to different villages, and in one story he sends out the 12, and another story he sends out 72, two by two, going into villages, and evangelizing them. Right? Remember these stories? You remember when Jesus sends them, he tells them to take nothing with them for the journey, and instead to use the generosity of the town, generosity of the people that are there, and receive help from homes and families that they're ministering to. And that's how they're supposed to, stay alive and take care of themselves. Jesus' introduction to the young man is in line with thinking to this as Jesus asks him to sell all that he owns. Jesus does truly say, if you want to be my disciple, if you want to go evangelize, get rid of everything and live for them. Now, at some level, I want to say that there's a good reason for all of this. And it's not because those materialistic things are evil inherently of themselves. It's the fact that if you're working for your wages, if you're working for making sure that you have food in your belly and clothes on your back and a roof over your head, you're going to work a lot harder, right? Than if you already have all that stuff and you're just like, you know what, this is getting hard. I've already got all that stuff. I'm going to go back home. And so when Jesus sends out the 72, or when Jesus sends out the 12, he tells them, don't take anything with you, because that will mean that you're going to have to interact with the populations of those villages. You're going to have to work really hard to build ministries and to do all that kind of stuff in order to get food, in order to get shelter, in order to get clothing, in order to get taken care of. And so at some level, it's an incentivizer, it's a motivator that says, if you don't have all that stuff just lying around and easily accessible, you're going to work really hard, a lot harder than you normally would, right? Now, the second thing is the rich young man's wealth was a stumbling block to his faith. And this is where we get that very fine line. Why I tell you that Jesus doesn't hate rich people. Jesus has no problem with people being materialistically wealthy. Now, I'm not going to go, towards the prosperity gospel here by any stretch of the imagination, but what I am going to say is that Jesus and God have no problem with people being millionaires, people having fancy cars, people having nice homes. That's not something that they're going to that Jesus would ultimately say is evil or sinful. What he is going to ask is, what have you done with what has been given to you? How much have you furthered the kingdom with what you have? Who is your God? That's the ultimate question. That's what he continues to ask people, and that's why he does say so many times that for the rich, it is very difficult to get into heaven, because wealth can become a god so quickly. And that's exactly what's happened to the rich young man. The rich young man is his God has become, well, he doesn't know that. He doesn't think that, but it has. And you see it with his final choice. This is another way of looking at it that appeases those of us who have worldly wealth, right? Because It's a stumbling block to his faith, because we don't want to be seen as the rich young man. And I say we because I guarantee you that most of the people that are watching this video are part of the rich, as it were, especially if you consider the entirety of the world. The United States is one of the richest countries in the world, and even people that are under the poverty line in the United States are still much more rich, or much richer than those that are around the world. But the fact of the matter is that we don't want to be condemned. We don't want to see that. So we claim that the man had an unhealthy attachment to his wealth, and that became his God in place of God. This is a good interpretation of the story, as there were some other disciples. There were some other disciples of the 12 who did have wealth. And the disciples, as a group, had a common purse, right? We know Judas took care of it, because that's what John tells us in his gospel, is that Judas was the one that took care of the finances. Judas was the one that made sure that the common purse was taken care of. So we know that they had money. It's not that Jesus and the disciples walked around penniless. But ultimately, I think what Jesus would say is, make sure you have what you need, but also be generous. Also work for the kingdom. And that work for the kingdom should come first and foremost above all other things, right? Now, these two interpretations of this story, either disciples must give up everything in order to become a disciple, right? Or that you don't have to give up your wealth as long as it's not a stumbling block of your faith. I think the actual true interpretation, the true meaning of this story falls somewhere in between. The young man probably did have an unhealthy relationship, an unhealthy understanding of his wealth as it pertains to his faith. It probably was somewhat of a stumbling block. However, what Jesus is also asking the young man is to completely change his life, completely change his worldview, completely change his life, so that everything he did, everything he saw was based on one thing: the kingdom. That's how Jesus lived his life. That's how Jesus did his ministry. Everything was focused on the kingdom. And he expects that of his disciples. And so Jesus tells the young man, as he tells us, you cannot follow and serve God unless you are willing to change everything about yourself to fit what he is calling you to do. He will change you into what he needs you to be. But are you willing to allow your entire life to be changed into what he wants you to be, into what he calls you to be, into what he expects you to be? The rich young man couldn't accept that change, and ultimately he leaves. Ultimately, the young man is distinguished from the enemies of Christ for one final reason. Okay? We're talking about, how he's distinguished from those enemies, and he's done so in one other way. And it's the way in which he leaves. His departure from Christ suggests that he really was looking forward to having a relationship with Christ, and was truly looking for a new way to view the world.
Maisie, what are you doing?
Unfortunately, he kind of shows us something that is within all of us. He tends to be able to go to God and say, use me however you see fit, but then says, ooh, wait, I don't want to do that. And so we have an issue there. That's where we find that issue. And we do this all the time, don't we? We go to God and we say, hey, use me, guide me, take me, use me for whatever purpose that you see fit. But then God says, okay, well, I want you to go do this. And you're like, I don't want to go there. What if I go and do this? That's something that we all do, right? Whether it's big or little, it's the same thing. The young man was no different. He shows us this thing in us. He goes and he has desire for eternal life and relationship with Christ. But when Christ tells him, okay, you want this? You want this relationship? You want to be my disciple? You want to follow me? Great. Here's what you have to do. Here's the cost. And the price is too steep. And he goes away. And here's the reason why I say that we want to really focus on the fact that he is not an enemy of Christ, but simply a regular human being. He is not a Pharisee or Sadducee or religious leader that is trying to undermine Christ or get rid of him. This is a regular Joe who is truly wanting this kind of relationship. But just like the rest of us, when we finally get the answer from Jesus of what it's going to cost us, we realize it's way too high and at some level we don't want to take it. Now, eventually a lot of us do. That's why we're Christians, why we're disciples ourselves. But it also is a cost that we have to continue to evaluate, right? Because he continually changes us. He continually challenges us. Now, I want to read a second part of the scripture, because after the young man leaves, he then turns to his 12, to his disciples and followers that are around him. And I want to read this part because this is starting in verse 23, and this is the second part I really want to focus on as well. Then Jesus looked around and said to his disciples, "How hard it will be for those who have wealth to enter the kingdom of God." And the disciples were perplexed at these words. But Jesus said to them again, "Children, how hard it is to enter the kingdom of God. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of heaven." They were greatly astounded and said to one another, "Then who can be saved?" And Jesus looked at them and said, "For mortals it is impossible, but not for God. For God, all things are possible." Now, this is Jesus' answer to the rich young man. He comes out and says that harsh word. Camel through the eye of a needle. That's how difficult it is for a rich person to get into heaven. Now, the first thing I do want to say is this idiom, camel through an eye of a needle. This has become a cliche of Christians for many generations. Why does Jesus use this analogy? Now, what we have to understand, if we want to really break down this, because what it seems like is Jesus says, okay, literally a camel through the eye of a needle. That will never, ever, ever, ever happen, right? You can't shrink a camel down small enough, and no one's going to make a needle that big, right? So what Jesus and the disciples tend to think the same way. Then who can be saved? If that's really the only way that they can be saved, then no one's getting saved, right? So, but we have to understand something about the society and the culture and some of the words that were being used. So I want to talk about wealth first and foremost. In Christ's world, the wealthy were celebrated, much like they are in today's society. If you had wealth, you were well known. You were popular. Everyone loved you. Everyone liked you. And at some level, when Jesus walked the earth in the first century, the prosperity gospel was alive and kicking. That was how the Jewish people understood it. Physical, material wealth was a manifestation of God's blessings. So if you had a lot of stuff, if you had a lot of sheep, if you had a lot of land, if you had a lot of wealth, that was indicative of the fact that you had favor with God. The more wealth you had, the more favor with God you had. That was their understanding. It was a back and forth statement. You didn't have a lot of money, well, then you weren't in favor with God. It's not surprising that this is how they understood things, because they understood this with illnesses. They understood this with social standing. They understood this with children. They understood this with everything, because they truly believed, especially Jewish people, they had that true monotheistic understanding, a true monotheistic religion where God was in control of literally everything. There was nothing that God did not control. If there was a bad thing that happened, God was the one that made it happen. And if there was a good thing, then God made that happen too. And they didn't have any problem with understanding the world that way. God was always at the center of every single event, major or minor, good or bad. And the reason that they could have this kind of understanding was the fact that you didn't question God. God was God. You don't question who he is. You don't question what he does. If he does something horrible, if a hurricane comes or a storm or an earthquake or something horrible, it was God passing judgment on those people. If a person was sick with any kind of disease, well, you must have had sin, and this is the just punishment for your sin. If you were poor and you were a slave, that was the fact that you didn't sacrifice enough. You weren't in with God yet. You weren't favored with God. His blessings were not raining down upon you. So you needed to work harder to make sure that God showed favor to you. But if you were at the pinnacle of society, if you were one of the leaders, if you had all the riches and gold and land and all that kind of stuff, well, then obviously the flip side of the coin is right there. If God bestows negative things upon people because they're not in his favor, then obviously if you've got a bunch of good stuff, if you're healthy and all that kind of stuff, then obviously God is favoring you. And so we have this kind of prosperity-like gospel even in the first century. And so Jesus's image about the camel is actually given to completely destroy the way that the society around him worships wealth and power as signs, not just in and of themselves, but as signs of God's favor and God's bestowing his grace upon them. He doesn't want people to look at a rich person and say, oh, well, God must love him more. Or to look at someone who has, and especially in that day and age, many children, many sons, and say, well, God favors him above me. That's not true. God favors all people at the same level. He loves all people. So Jesus wants us to understand that these things are mutually exclusive of one another. Just because they have a lot of money doesn't mean that God favors them. Just because they have a lot of wealth doesn't mean that they are disciples who know God and God knows them. It doesn't necessarily mean that they can't be. The rich young man proves this. He has a lot of wealth and he knows God. So it's not necessarily the fact that they can't go hand in hand. It's the simple fact of, in their day and age, they believed that it always went hand in hand. You had wealth, you had stuff, you were good with God. Period. The end. And Jesus is saying, no, that's not true. Just because you have wealth, just because you have all this stuff, doesn't mean that you are always right with God. And as a matter of fact, it means that more than likely you probably aren't. Now, the question that the disciples then say is, does that mean that no wealthy people can be saved? As I said, the disciples are astonished at this answer for two reasons. The first is the first question: can no one that is rich be saved? Right? Was it destined that the rich young man was absolutely going to turn away? Right? And we even have some very positive examples. One of the major ones that I can think of right off the top of my head is Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was, you know the story, the wee little man that climbed up on the sycamore tree, all that other kind of stuff. But who was Zacchaeus? He was a tax collector. He was I wouldn't say a really good tax collector. He was a very wealthy tax collector because he did everything he was supposed to as a tax collector. He collected not only the taxes from the people, but he skimmed off the top enough that he had made a fortune, right? He made truckloads, hands over fist of money. And it was astonishing to the disciples that it seemed like Christ was saying to them that the only way to get God's saving grace was to be poor. Because that's what it seemed like. But when you look at Zacchaeus, did he go poor? No. He paid back everything twofold or whatever it was. I'd have to go back to the story to remember exactly. But, I mean, yeah, Zacchaeus changed his ways, but he didn't stop being a tax collector. He stopped defrauding people, but he didn't stop being a tax collector. He gave back what he stole with interest and all that other kind of stuff. But the story really indicates to us that even after doing that, Zacchaeus probably had plenty of money left over. So Zacchaeus proves to us that a rich man can get into heaven, can be saved, can become a disciple of Christ. It all depends on their attitude with that money. As I said, the society that Peter and the rest of the disciples have been living in, the wealthy were supposed to be the ones who had found favor with God, which means that the impoverished, like the sick and the downtrodden, have no ability to receive God's blessing and grace until they sacrifice the right things or say the right prayers or do all that kind of stuff. So in their minds, when they hear this from Jesus, it says that the rich are going to have an impossible time to get into heaven. Well, if they're the ones that are closest to God in the worldview that Peter and them are looking at, if they're the ones that have all the favor, that have all the salvation attached to them, and Jesus then comes out and says they aren't getting in, or it's incredible, or it's impossible for them to get in, then what about the poor souls that are below them? What about all of the other people? And ultimately what the disciples are sitting there saying is, if the wealthy can't get in, then there's no chance for any of us to ever get in, even close. If the wealthy can't get the blessings, then it stands to reason that no one can. That's where the disciples are at this point. When they hear this message from Christ, they're just flabbergasted because it's turning their entire world upside down. They have grown up in this society. They know this society, and they believe this society. The wealthy are supposed to be the ones that you aspire to be, the ones that you look up to, the ones that are closest to God. And Jesus turns around and says, no, they're actually the furthest. And the first thought is that, well, if they're the furthest, then we're even farther, right? So this phrase by Christ has been a stumbling block for many Christians. But that is because we are thinking like so many in the stories that we've been reading. We think that it's impossible for the camel to fit through the eye of the needle, which is true. But Jesus turns this whole thing on its head yet again. He turns the whole world on its head when he says, wealthy men, wealthy persons only can make it it's like a camel going through the eye of a needle. He turns the society on its head, and then he turns this phrase on its head. And he does that because he then says, we need to refocus. Don't focus on the camel. Don't focus on the needle. Yes, that's impossible. But remember, through God, all things are possible. Of course, you can't do it. Of course, you can't put a camel through the eye of a needle. That's impossible. But what about the God that we follow? Can't he do the impossible? Can't he create a camel that's small enough to go through a needle? Can't he create a needle that's big enough for a camel for a regular sized camel to walk through? All this kind of stuff. Jesus is sitting there saying, it's impossible with humans, sure. But that's why you're wrong, because you keep focusing on humans. You're not focusing on God. Jesus tells the disciples, and he tells us in the same breath, that while it may be impossible for a mortal to fit a camel through the eye of a needle, there's nothing impossible that God cannot do. And so this whole statement that says, well, the wealthy can't get in heaven, garbage. The wealthy can't have salvation. No, that's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus is ultimately saying that every single one of us has our own stumbling block. Every single one of us has something that is keeping us from being perfect. And I would probably argue we've got a lot of things, right? But you know what I mean. The rich young man had one stumbling block. I think that's one of the reasons why I love this story so much about the rich young man, is because it really solidifies this understanding. Because the rich young man literally only had one stumbling block to overcome. Because he was the perfect Jew. He had lived the entire law. Jesus affirmed that. And Jesus says there's only one thing left for you to do in order for you to be my disciple, in order for you to follow me. Because the rich young man had already accepted the fact that he didn't have all the information, that he didn't have everything that he needed. He needed Christ. He needed Christ's understanding in order to go forward. And Jesus says you are only one step away. This one stumbling block is your problem. Get rid of that, and you will have reached perfection. Right? And he can't do it. But what Jesus turns around and says, look, guys, everyone is given grace. Everyone's given salvation. Salvation is for every single person. Yes, is it hard for a rich person to get into heaven as a camel through the eye of a needle? Of course. But it's also as hard for anyone else. And yet, all other people are granted salvation if they choose God. What we as mortals deem as impossible, God just sits in his chair and laughs. Because God can do anything. There's nothing that God can't do. And so when Jesus says the eye of a needle and the camel and all that kind of stuff, he's not saying that every person has to get rid of everything. He's saying that you have to get rid of what's causing you to stumble. You have to get rid of stuff that stops you from being the person that you are meant to be. You have to get rid of the thing that keeps you from being focused solely on the kingdom. And that is what grace is all about. That's how grace is supposed to be strong and how it works. Jesus loves every person who came into contact with him, but he called their stumbling blocks out. He asked them to change their worldviews, to change their understandings, to change who they were so that they could become who they were supposed to be. Of course he loves you where you are. Of course he loves you in the midst of your sin. Of course he loves you when you've hit absolute rock bottom. But I'll never forget the analogy that one of my good friends likes to use, and that is, if you were to go to a hospital, would you be comforted by a doctor who didn't believe in getting you healthy, but only believed in making you live? That you would stay in the hospital for the rest of your life? No. We want doctors to heal us, which sometimes means surgeries, medicines, so many other things that heal but also hurt, right? But the ultimate goal is that within a short period of time, hopefully, you're able to walk out the doors of the hospital and go home and live. Grace is the same thing. Grace is the perfect doctor who sees us in the midst of our sin, in the midst of our pain, and says, I love you right now, but I want you to be better. Let me heal you. Let me change you. Let me make you into what you're supposed to be. And as I said when we started this lesson today, that's the problem that the world is having today, and that's what we as a church need to change, is that grace has everything to do with change and with the starting point. It's both. Acceptance has nothing to do with grace. Will you pray with me? Heavenly Father, again, we give you thanks that we have this time to come together to study your word and to understand you just a little bit better. I pray and hope that we can extend the right kind of grace. We can extend the grace that we have been given to all those around us, not to be judgmental, not to push people away, but for them to see what you see in them, what they could be, what they have the potential to be. We pray all this in Christ's name. Amen. All right, brothers and sisters, we will continue with Lunch with the Pastor next Thursday at noon. We'll start a new series of lessons then. And then, of course, we have communion on Sunday, the drive-through communion on Sunday from 1 to 2. Please tell your friends, tell your family members, tell your neighbors about it. Have them all come out and let's celebrate the Lord's Supper together. And then, of course, we also have our regular worship services, both in person at 9:45 and 10 o'clock. 9 o'clock and 10:45 on Sunday morning, as well as our online worship through our YouTube channel that is kicked off at 10:45 in the morning as well on Sunday morning. So make sure that all those things are on your calendar so that you know what's going on. And I look forward to seeing y'all either on Sunday in person or back here for the Lunch with Pastor next Thursday at noon. God bless y'all.